Hello, everyone, and welcome to Toolkit.law's 2025 CLE webinar. I'm attorney Gigi Ijaz Khan, and I'm truly honored to guide you through this important topic, international organizations with respect to domestic violence. We're going to explore a curated help sheet that identifies some of the most influential organizations and frameworks working to prevent and respond to domestic violence across the globe. Why does this matter? Domestic violence is a human rights violation and a legal issue that transcends borders. In every jurisdiction, lawyers and advocates are called upon to protect survivors, promote accountability, and push for reform. But as many of us know, not all survivors have access to fair legal systems, and some countries still lack protective laws or enforcement mechanisms altogether. That's where international organizations play an essential role. They help fill legal gaps, provide humanitarian and legal services, support survivors across jurisdictions, and most importantly, hold governments accountable. This help sheet breaks things down by region, starting with Asia and the Middle East, then Europe and Africa, then North and Central America, and finally Oceania, Australia. In each section, we'll look at key institutions, grassroots efforts, legal aid programs, and how these resources support survivors when local systems fall short. Whether you're an attorney, social worker, policy advocate, or law student, my hope is that you walk away from this webinar with not just information, but practical tools to incorporate into your work. I'll share my screen now, and we will begin with the first column on the first page. Now, we'll cover 4 geographic areas exactly as they appear in the help sheet: Asia and Middle East, Europe and Africa, followed by North and Central America, and then Oceania, Australia. Let's begin with the first column. Asia and Middle East. Domestic violence in Asia and the Middle East is shaped by a unique intersection of cultural norms, legal traditions, and access to justice barriers. Survivors in this region often face not only systematic challenges, but also deeply rooted societal stigma. The organizations in this section play a critical role in bridging gaps between legal protections and survivor needs. Now, the first organization that we see here is UN Women Asia Pacific. UN Women is a cornerstone institution in advancing women's rights across Asia Pacific. It works with national governments to pass and implement legislation protecting survivors of domestic violence. Their partnerships with ARROW and the Center for Women's Rights focus on the intersection of law and community empowerment. For example, through ARROW, they support policy research and monitoring frameworks to track gender-based violence legislation and its enforcement. UN Women also invests in training programs for police, judges, and shelter workers, ensuring survivors are met with empathy and professionalism. The next organization we have here is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. This association facilitates regional cooperation on domestic violence policy. Their gender policy advocacy program encourages legislative harmonization across borders, especially critical in migrant-heavy and conflict-prone areas. By supporting organizations like SWAN and BLAST, this association strengthens cross-national collaboration. One initiative involved joint dialogues between Nepal and Bangladesh on protection orders and survivor shelter access, creating a framework for transnational survivor mobility and protection. The third one that we have here is the Middle East Women's Rights Network. This operates in a region where gender violence intersects with political instability and legal limitation. It works alongside national bodies like the Jordanian National Commission for Women and the Lebanese Council to Resist Violence Against Women. Together, they push for policy change while also providing practical legal aid and crisis counseling. Their mobile clinics and legal caravans bring services to rural and refugee hosting areas, giving survivors access where courts and shelters may be unreachable. As with any country out there, countries in the Asia and Middle East region also have national helplines. For example, helplines like India's 181, Pakistan's Madadgar, and UAE's Aman service offer vital lifelines. These hotlines are often a survivor's first step towards safety. Staffed by trained counselors and legal experts, they provide information on protective laws, emergency housing, and policy reporting. Madadgar, for instance, in Pakistan, not only responds to calls, but also offers legal follow ups, connecting women with attorneys or filing court petitions where needed. The next box talks about refugee and conflict zone initiatives. In regions affected by war or displacement, the risk of domestic violence escalates. Displaced women may be separated from their families or support networks and face exploitation in refugee camps. The International Rescue Committee and UNHCR address these risks by setting up safe shelters, legal clinics, and mobile documentation services. In Syria, for example, IRC has run women's protection spaces that provide trauma counseling and legal orientation. UNHCR has similarly partnered with host countries to include gender-based violence in refugee protection frameworks. The last box for this column is the legal literacy and community awareness programs. Raising awareness about domestic violence laws is the cornerstone of prevention. Organizations like Women for Afghan Women and the Asian Human Rights Commission engage communities through seminars, religious leader engagement, and radio programming. Their goal is to shift public perception while also empowering survivors to understand their rights. For example, in rural Afghanistan, the Women for Afghan Women outreach has helped increase the number of self-reported domestic violence cases, signaling greater confidence in legal resources. Let's move on to the next column, Europe and Africa. Domestic violence in Europe and Africa spans a wide legal spectrum. While Europe often benefits from supranational frameworks and advanced policy infrastructure, Africa faces challenges of implementation and access. However, both continents have strong legal movements, regional treaties, and organizations advocating for survivor rights and institutional reform. For example, the first organization we see here is the Council of Europe, and which specifically talks about the Istanbul Convention. The Istanbul Convention is one of the most comprehensive international treaties addressing violence against women and domestic violence. It legally binds European countries to criminalize abuse, train law enforcement, and fund survivors' services. It goes beyond policy. It requires real accountability. Supported by the European Institute for Gender Equality and WAVE, the treaty has led to increased access to protection orders, shelter expansion, and the establishment of monitoring mechanisms. Lawyers working in cross-border family law can rely on its standards when assessing a survivor's rights across multiple EU jurisdictions. The next organization we have in this column is the European Women's Lobby. The EWL represents over 2,000 member organizations across Europe and is one of the continent's loudest voices for legislative reform. Their coalition include frontline groups like the UK Women's Aid and France's FNF. EWL coordinates policy advocacy at the European Parliament level and has successfully campaigned for more funding for shelters and integration of domestic violence into national public health and justice strategies. They also lead intersectional advocacy, highlighting the compounded discrimination faced by migrant women and women with disabilities. Next up, we have the African Union, and more specifically, its Maputo Protocol. The protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, commonly known as the Maputo Protocol, requires African Union member states to enact and enforce laws against domestic violence. The protocol addresses a wide range of gendered abuses and mandates state funding for shelters, education, and access to justice. Its implementation is monitored with help from civil society actors like, for example, the African Women's Development and Communication Network and Equality Now Africa, who provide training and documentation to hold governments accountable. Next up, we have the gender-based violence hotlines. Much like the previous column, hotlines are essential tools in both Europe and Africa as well. They offer 24/7 access to emotional support, legal aid referrals, and crisis management. For example, France's 3919 helpline is one of the most widely publicized, offering multilingual services. In Africa, South Africa's GBV Command Center incorporates video call options for the hearing impaired, while Nigeria's Mirabel Center helpline coordinates directly with legal and forensic units, an essential link when cases move towards prosecution. The second last box in this column is the NGO-led assistance program. Survivors navigating legal systems often encounter high legal fees, illiteracy, and fear of retaliation. NGOs like the AIR Center and the Legal Resources Center offer free legal representation and legal literacy workshops. These organizations help survivors obtain restraining orders, file domestic violence charges, and pursue child custody or maintenance claims. Rights they often don't realize they have until aided by a legal advisor. Now, moving on to the last box. Social media. We live in the era of social media right now. Social media and digital advocacy campaigns, movements like Spain's Ni Una Menos and South Africa's Total Shutdown are not just hashtags. They've shaped public discourse and legislative agendas. Total Shutdown led to a national summit on GBV in South Africa, prompting policy commitments on funding and accountability. Legal professionals should be aware of these campaigns, and they are often the first step in public pressure that results in legal reform. Social media also plays a growing role in survivor storytelling, which helps challenge stigma. Moving on to the second page, we have North and Central America. Now, North and Central America presents a region of significant legal diversity, ranging from federal protections in the United States to treaty-driven regional initiatives in Latin America. Across its landscape, survivors rely on both national services and international agreements to obtain safety and justice. First up, we have the Canadian Women's Foundation. This foundation plays a leading role in funding shelters, legal aid, and education initiatives across Canada. It collaborates with organizations such as Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment and Women's Shelters Canada to improve survivor safety and push for legislative change. Through their grants, many organizations have been able to open rural shelters and expand legal representation for immigrant and Indigenous women. Secondly, we have the U.S. National Domestic Violence Hotline, critical access point for survivors in crisis. This 24/7 hotline provides real-time safety planning, referrals to legal aid and shelters, and emotional support. It also trains responders in trauma-informed care. Organizations like the National Network to End Domestic Violence and GB Leap support the hotline's advocacy and legal outreach work, making it a cornerstone in the U.S. response network. The third organization we see in this column is the Organization of American States. Now, the convention or the treaty that they signed in 1994 is a landmark for the Americas. It requires nations to criminalize domestic violence and support survivors. Countries such as Mexico, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic have implemented new laws and survivor services under its guidance. The Inter-American Commission of Women and CLADIM monitors state compliance and help develop training materials for law enforcement and judges to interpret domestic violence legislation effectively. Next up, we have the widely popularly known International Justice Mission, or the IJM. Now, the IJM's work in Latin America includes partnerships with prosecutors and police to improve case outcomes for survivors. Their focus is solely on strengthening the justice system to hold perpetrators accountable and ensure long-term survivor protection. In countries like Guatemala and the Dominican Republic, they also provide legal aid and support services for women escaping high-risk environments. The second last box talks about the organization known as the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. This is one of the most active US-based policy organizations dedicated to ending domestic violence through systematic change. They were instrumental in developing and defending the Violence Against Women Act, and they continue to advocate at the state and federal level for laws that improve housing rights, access to legal services, and firearm restrictions for abusers. Their public awareness campaign also empowers survivors through education and storytelling. Now, the last organization in this column is the Women's National Law Center. This ensures legal protection for survivors are enforced and interpreted correctly. The organization pushes for reform at both state and federal levels and often participates in high-impact litigation to influence precedent. The last column on this page is Oceania, Australia. Oceania, particularly Australia and the Pacific Islands, demonstrates a well-developed yet evolving framework for addressing domestic violence. Government-backed services exist alongside culturally sensitive legal aid programs that reflect the need of Indigenous and rural communities. Sorry about that. The first thing we talk about in this column is Australia's national 24/7 helpline, that is 1800 Respect. This is funded by the federal government and operated in partnership with health, law enforcement, and social services. It connects survivors to counseling, legal information, and emergency housing. The service also provides specialized support for people with disabilities and multilingual access for migrant communities. Next up, we have the Domestic Violence Victoria. This acts as the peak advocacy body in Victoria, coordinating reform across the legal, social, and medical sectors. Their efforts led to the establishment of the Royal Commission into Family Violence, which spurred sweeping legislative and funding changes in the state. It also trains frontline workers and supports best practices for culturally safe interventions. The third organization we have in this column is the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Clearinghouse. This contributes policy-relevant research and maintains one of the most comprehensive repositories on domestic and family violence in Australia. Their publications help lawyers, social workers, and policymakers stay informed about evidence-based solutions, trends in case law, and community feedback. Next up, we have the Salvation Army Australia. This international humanitarian organization provides a broad array of domestic violence services, from legal clinics and crisis housing to long-term trauma recovery programs. Their No Excuse for Abuse campaign has raised national awareness and positioned the organization as a key partner in state-run family safety plans. The second last box we have here talks about the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development. Supported by the Australian government, this initiative partners with the Fiji Women's Crisis Center and New Guinea's Family and Sexual Violence Action Committee to deliver legal training, survivor support, and national strategy design. Their work emphasizes localization, ensuring that legal tools and services reflect the unique social fabric of each Pacific Island country. Last but not the least, Family Violence Prevention Legal Services. This provides Indigenous women and children with culturally appropriate legal advice and representation in family law, child protection, and criminal matters. These services are critical in overcoming systemic racism and geographic isolation. Collaboration with organizations like the Aboriginal Family Legal Services and the Queensland Indigenous Family Violence Legal Service ensure that community-based solutions are front and central. Across every region we've discussed today, we've seen examples of resilience, reform, and advocacy, from international treaties like the Istanbul Convention to legal aid clinics in refugee camps, national hotlines, and survivor-led awareness campaigns. These organizations and agreements don't just provide services, they influence legislation, train justice sector professionals, fund shelters, and give survivors a voice. But what ties all of this together is the recognition that domestic violence isn't just a private matter, it's a legal and human rights crisis that requires consistent cross border collaboration. As legal professionals, we have a unique role to play, not just to defend or advise our clients, but to advocate for systems that make justice acceptable and for policies that center survivor dignity and safety. So, what can you do with this information? Use the help sheet to refer clients to reliable on the ground resources in other jurisdictions. Build cross border relationships with organizations featured in the help sheet. Advocate for your local bar associations or firms to adopt best practices shared by these global leaders. Educate others in your legal community about regional frameworks that they may not be familiar with. Thank you again for taking the time to engage with this vital issue. I hope this session deepens your awareness and sharpens your tools as we collectively work towards safety and justice for all survivors.